Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you a great method of painting a Saturnine Dreadnought in the colours of the Salamanders Legionis Astartes for the Horus Heresy by Games Workshop. Now this of course is a brand new miniature and it is massive, but it's not all that difficult to paint so long as you approach it in the right way, and in this video we're going to be walking you through that entire process. And whilst we are painting it in the colours of the Salamanders, you can still use the methods we're going to show you here to paint it in the colours of any legion that you might want to paint. So no matter what colour scheme you're going for, we hope you enjoyed this video. Let's get started. To get a good start in painting your Saturnine Dreadnought, it's a good idea first of all to think about some sub-assemblies because some of these really help out, particularly around the shoulders and on the weapon arms here. I chose to build the miniature as the main body of the Dreadnought, but I kept the armour plates of the shoulders separate and also the actual weapons of the arms separate as well. This is to allow easy access to all the various details, and whilst you could stick the entire thing together as one assembly, it will be a little bit tricky to get to certain parts, so I do recommend doing assemblies like this. It also means we can undercoat the components in different colours to help us get started on painting the miniature. And for Salamanders, I find a green undercoat actually works really well. So here I've used Rattle Green for the main body from the Colour Forge, and then for the other components, so the shoulder plates and the weapons, which are predominantly black, silver and gold, in this case I've used matte black also from the Colour Forge. But any colours like this will be absolutely fine to get things going. Now when it comes to painting a model like this, so any sort of Space Marine Dreadnought, it's a good idea to start out by tackling the internal machinery, so that interior skeleton. And so to do this, what I like to do is start out by roughly applying a silver onto all these parts, just to get things going really. So what you need is a good base coat silver. I'm going to use some Surcoat silver, and to apply it you just want some rough base coating brushes. Now because of the size of this miniature, I'm starting out with quite a big brush here. This is actually a medium dry brush from Citadel. I do have a small dry brush on hand as well for the more tricky to reach areas where it's just hard to get the brush into those components, but this is good for most of it. And with it what you need to do is just thin that paint down with a touch of water, just being careful with a brush of this size because it is easy to overdo it. So once you've got some of that silver ready, it's just a matter of painting all that machinery. So look around the miniature for areas such as around the back just here and just roughly block it in, making sure to work the colour into all the nooks and crannies. Now during the process of this you probably will catch parts that are going to be green later on, but just try to keep that to a minimum. It doesn't matter if you get them a little bit because some of that green undercoat will still show through and help with the base coating later, but if you do catch them a bit, as I say, it doesn't really matter very much. Here's the model with all that silver now blocked in quite roughly. You can see I've done it on the weapons too, such as the disintegrator just here. And if we take a look at the back of the Dreadnought, you can see as well all those silver parts I picked out just there. And so with that done, we can now apply our first wash into the miniature. And to begin with now, we should go with a black wash. So here I'm going to be using Oblivion black wash, and to apply it, you just want a really large brush. And you could use one of those dry brushes again if you wanted to. I'm going for a medium shade brush from Citadel though, but the choice really is yours. And with it, what you do is load up a generous amount of the paint, then to start painting it directly over all that silver, really making sure once again to work it into the nooks and crannies as you go along. Now we are of course applying quite a lot of this paint, so it's inevitable that some of it is going to drip off the miniature, so if you haven't already, be sure to put down something to protect your work surface like some newspaper or a cutting mat or something like that. And once you have painted it all over the miniature, be sure to give it plenty of time to dry. I recommend leaving it for at least an hour before you move on to the next stage. Once that's dry, you can see we've got some nice shading there on all of that silver, including once again on the back of the Dreadnought where there is some really quite large areas. And so with that done, we can now move on to the next stage, which is to base coat some more metallics on the miniature, because right now we've got some really large areas of silver, which on their own will look a little bit dull. So what we can do is add a bit more interest to them by breaking them up with some other colours. Now these can be any sort of colours you want, but I recommend going for sort of like bronzy, brassy colours for this sort of thing. So I'm going to use Spartan Bronze for it. Then once that's done, what we should do is pick out the decorative metal too. And for this we want a nice gold for the Salamanders. So here I'm going to be using Dragon's Gold. But we'll start out with Spartan Bronze, and to apply this I've gone for a size 1 brush from Artsopus. So this is about the same size as a medium layer brush from Citadel, basically a normal brush. It's ideal for this sort of thing because the details we're going to pick out tend to be all quite large, so a brush of this size is good for it. What you need to do is just thin the paint down with a touch of water and then just start looking around the machinery for opportunities to break up the areas of silver with a bit of this colour. So for example, on the back of the Dreadnought, things such as this cap we've got here on the power generator, this is ideal for it. And all you do is just neatly block it in. But it can be as much or as little as you like. We're looking for things like this. You can also pick out central parts and joints, such as this little circular bit right here. Also the muzzles of guns are pretty good to do as well, such as these ones right around here. Once you're happy with all those bronze details, the next thing to do is start looking for any decorative parts and pick them out with a gold. So here I'm using some Dragon's Gold, applied again using the size 1 brush. I'm looking for things such as the collar around here, just around the head, but on the shoulders there is a large amount of gold trim, so don't forget to go at those parts at this stage as well. And once we've got those 2 metallics base coated as well, we can then move on to applying a wash onto these, and we can also put it onto the silver at the same time. And what this is going to do is lend a slightly grimy appearance to the machinery, so good for like oiled metal and things, but also it's going to shade that bronze and that gold and really embed it all together. So what you want is a dark brown wash. I'm going to be using some Battlewood wash here, and to apply it I'm going to be starting out with that medium shade brush, but you might want to have a larger one on hand, because what we want to do with this is apply it over all 3 of the metallics now. So load up a generous amount and then just start applying it in just the same way that you did with that black earlier on, but now making sure to also include the gold and the brass. Now, just like before, we are putting on quite a lot of this, so remember, once you have painted it over these metallics, be sure to give the miniature plenty of time to dry, and I do recommend leaving it for about an hour once again. And here we have these pieces with that wash dried. Now in some flat areas, like on that gold trim, you will get a little bit of pooling in some areas, but don't worry about that because we'll clean that up later on. But first of all, what we should do is concentrate on that silver. And because it's so textured, we can dry brush this. And it is important just to make sure we start to build it up, because in some areas you will find, once again, there's a bit of pooling, but dry brushing will still deal with that. As long as we start out with the same silver that we started with originally. So in our case, we're going to go back to Surcoat Silver for this. Then we'll move on to a brighter silver for a highlight, again with a dry brush application. So here we're going to use some Mythril Blade. But we'll start out with Surcoat Silver, and to apply it this time I'm going for a small dry brush from Citadel, and what we need to do is just load up some of this on the brush like this, then get some tissue paper and use it to work that paint into the brush, and then remove the excess paint too. So basically just gradually work your way along like this to the side until you're down to around about this strength of paint appearing on the paper. So that's the sort of strength that we want to put onto the miniature. And what you do is start looking for larger, smoother areas of silver, such as on these rounded parts we got on these exhausts around here, and just start softly applying it in a slightly rounded motion. So if I go slowly, you can see what I'm doing is a round application there like that, because this ensures that the brush will catch the flatter areas whilst also not having the time to fall into the recesses. And you can see by focusing it on that area, we start to really burnish it there with that silver. It almost buffs it to get that nice sort of bright silver appearing on that curve there like that. So we're looking to do this on all these smoother areas, including all these vents. We've got this central ridge just here on the legs. There's some parts such as around the front of it just there. So I want to gradually build up this colour on those areas just to clean it up in preparation for the highlight. Once you've brought the colour up to this point with that first dry brush, we can then move on to a second one to highlight all the silver now, this time using Mythril Blade. So quite a light silver here, and I have switched up to a medium dry brush just to cover a little bit more ground a bit quicker here. And this time for the application, we're looking for more of a light flicking motion so that the lighter silver catches the edges and corners, but doesn't really have the time to catch flat panels. So just very gently, lightly across the miniature like this. And there we are with that done. You can see now we've got some nice highlights on that silver metal. So what we'll do is move on to doing some highlights on that bronze metal, but for this what we need is a little bit more control. So here I'm going to be using some top brass, and to apply it I'm going for a size 0 brush this time. So a little bit smaller than the size 1 we used earlier, but any medium to small brush with a good point and it'll be absolutely fine here. And what we need to do is thin this right down so it's a little bit translucent, down to about that sort of point there, and then we just need to introduce it towards the top of all these brass details with a light wood catch. So for example, if we take a look at the front of the Dreadnought just here, you can see I've got a few small details towards the top that I picked out with bronze earlier on. And with this, we're just looking for these edges, such as around here. So I just want to follow those very gently to add that nice shine to those parts. And then on these edges just here as well, you can see what this does is just catches the light and helps these details stand out. When it comes to curved areas, such as this part that we've got here on the back of the Dreadnought, in this case we just want to do a crescent towards the top with a light wood catch on the disc just here. So that means just a fine line that goes around the top and then down the side just there. And there we are, that brass has been highlighted too. You can see there on the disintegrator, but also on the back of the Dreadnought, we've got those various small details picked out with that highlight too. So now we're going to move away from those metallics because it's time to start painting in all the green armor panels. And at this stage, definitely make sure you have clean water if you haven't done so already to avoid any little metal flecks getting into the paint that you're about to apply, because what we need to do is establish that main color for the Salamander's armor. Now I'm going to be using some Vulkan Green for this one, and to apply it, I'm actually going for a medium base coat brush from Citadel and a fairly new one that's holding a relatively good point point here, but really any sort of medium-sized brush that holds a point would be ideal here. But this one is quite good just for doing some large areas, which is why I'm starting out with this one. What we need to do is get some of this paint onto the palette and then thin it down with that touch of water to ensure it's nice and smooth, and then it's just a matter of blocking in all the armour that needs to be green. So for example, around the front of the Dreadnought just here, we're looking at panels like this. All you need to do is block it in. Now this colour is a little bit weak, so when you're going into this, just expect to have to apply it as 3 or 4 thin coats, but it is important to make sure those coats are thin and smooth to avoid any brush marks appearing on the miniature. And you can see as you get around to other details like this pipe here, just take your time to make sure that you don't drift onto parts that we've already painted. And here we have that green applied. Now I did notice as I was doing this, there is a bit of gold trim that I missed earlier on, just here on the insides of the legs, so I have picked that out and applied the wash just like the rest of the gold. But with that done, we can now move on to the next step, which is to add some shading onto that green. And here what you'll need is a black wash. So I'm going to use Oblivion black wash, and to apply it this time I'm going to go for quite a different sort of approach, and that we need to be much more careful with it. So I'm using a small brush here. This is a size 00, so about the same size as a small layer brush from Citadel. And with it, we just need to load up a small amount of wash, so we've still got a fairly good point on the brush, and then start running it into all the recesses and panel lines and things that you can find on the Dreadnought's body. So for example, around the front of the sarcophagus just here, you can see there's recesses of these panels, and what we want to do is paint it directly into those corners to get shading in those areas. So just take your time, be as neat as you can, and if you do happen to splash onto any of the flat parts of the panels, just let the wash dry and then clean back up with Vulkan Green before you continue. And with that done, we've now got shading on the green, so we can move on to highlighting it. And whilst you could dry brush the green here, you do need to be careful if you decide to do that, because a lot of it goes really close to some of that silver detail we've done so far. So instead, I do recommend doing some edge highlighting here, so that's what I'm going to be doing. And start out with what we want is a sort of medium olive green. So the colour I'm going to be using here is some Gung-ho Green, and to apply it, I recommend going for a smaller brush with a fine point on it. So here, I'm using my size 00. Now with this green, what we're looking to do is to pick out all the edges and corners and raised details on the green armour panels. So to do that, let's make sure you thin that paint down so it's at that sweet spot where it flows well from your brush, but not so thin that it runs out of control. You're looking for it to be something like this. So this sort of strength. Once you've got that prepared, just remove the excess off your brush by just twisting it there on the palette to bring the bristles together, and then we can start applying it. And we're looking for corners such as these ones on the front of the sarcophagus just here. Now a lot of them, you can approach the side of the brush and just skim along that edge, holding the brush around about 45 degrees away from the flat edges. And this way the brush just catches that corner and gives you a sharp highlight really quickly and really easily. And basically what you do is just follow it all the way around, just always taking care to avoid surrounding details. Now you won't always be able to get the brush in like this. In some cases the detail's too fine, or the surrounding details that make it too tricky to get the brush in there, such as this little panel line just here, in which case just angle the model so you're painting in a downward motion, and with the tip of the brush just follow that edge as neatly as you can, such as around there. In addition, keep an eye out for any details that stand out, such as rivets, and be sure to just pop a bit of this colour on these as well. And here we have the green with that highlight applied. Now you can leave that there if you want to, but as this Dreadnought is such a centrepiece to the army, you might want to push it a little bit further, in which case what you can do is add a second edge highlight with a lighter shade of an olive green with a little bit of a yellow in there to help it pop. So we're going to do that now using some green beret, and to apply it you definitely want to stick to your small brush, so again I'm going for the size 00. Now whilst this is an edge highlight again, this time it's going to be a bit more selective, focusing on sharper corners and rivets and things that really stand out. So when you're setting up, you don't need very much paint on your brush, but you do need to make sure you thin it down just like before. And so the sort of thing that we're going to be taking a look at if we go to the sarcophagus just here is going to be corners where some of these edges come together. So for example, you can see a little corner just there. So what we want to do is just do a fine highlight, just skimming in that region just there to make the green ever so slightly lighter in that region. Same on these corners just here, where again you can see those previous highlights coming together. So just there and just there and just there. Very gently applying that skimming motion just to get that little bit of a lighter green in that region. Now in addition, we want to look out for any rivets and things that stand out too, and with this all you do is just dot this colour on the tip of them there like this. And there we are with that done. The green is now fully highlighted. So we're now at a stage where we could actually glue on the shoulder plates onto the Dreadnought, because we painted all those main details up here underneath them. So I'm going to do that now. Remember, when you are gluing together your sub-assemblies, it's a good idea to do it with a small amount of super glue. Don't use plastic glue because it will melt your paint and it can ruin your model. So I'm just going to do that now with a little bit of super glue. Then we'll move on to the next thing, which is going to be to paint the gold. Here we have those shoulder plates glued on, and I've not glued on the actual weapon arms yet. That's just to keep them out of the way for the time being, just so they don't get in the way of any of the details we might encounter as we go along. But with those on there, we can now concentrate on finishing off the gold. And the first thing to do here is to clean the gold up. So what we now need to do is to layer it with the original gold metallic we used, which in our case is Dragon's Gold. Now to apply this one, I'm going for my size 1 brush here, but it's a good idea to have a smaller one on hand for the smaller, more intricate golden areas. And with this, what you need to do is just thin it down so it's nice and smooth on the palette and a little bit translucent too. So about that sort of consistency just there. And then what you need to do is return to all these golden details and reapply this, but this time being careful to avoid recesses. So for example, you can see this band that we got here just beneath the head on the collar. What we're going to do is concentrate on the middle of this area just here, but I'm not going quite into the recess where it meets the trim. So by doing this, we retain that definition that we got from the wash earlier on. And with that done, you can see once more we have that lovely shine on all of that gold decoration. And because we were careful to avoid the recesses, we still got the definition from the shading too. So now we can move on to the next step, which is to highlight that gold. And for this, what you want is a pale white gold. So I'm going to use some glistening gold, and to apply it, I'm going back to the size 00 brush, because this is going to be some more edge highlighting, just like what we did on that green earlier on, when we looked for all the edges and corners and things. So what you need to do is just make sure you got that paint thinned down and under control on your brush, just being careful not to overload it, so that you have that fine point there on the bristles. And then we can start looking for all the edges on these gold details. And these do stand out really nicely, so it's actually quite easy to use the side of the brush for just about all of it. So for example, on the shoulder plate just here, you can see nice and easy to access that part. When you're using this technique, just always make sure that your hand control on the brush is nice and comfortable. So just change the model as you need to. That includes on the inside of this trim as well, such as just around here. And with that, we've now completed painting that gold detail, so it's time to move on to the next colour, which is going to be the black. And when it comes to the black on this miniature, there's actually going to be 2 shades of it, starting out with a sort of off black, which is going to be for more soft details, followed by a pitch black, which is going to be for the armour. So we'll start out with the former of the two, which is that sort of soft black. So here I'm going to use some Death Reaper, which is basically a really, really dark grey. And to apply it, I'm going for my size 0 brush here, because this one is going to be for, as I say, any sort of soft black area. So we're looking at things such as rubber pipes, treads, that sort of thing. So what you need to do is make sure the paint's thinned down and under control on your brush, and then it's time to start hunting around for these. And there will be some of these details on weaponry, but the most obvious example is these cables that we've got on the front of the sarcophagus just up here. So I just want to base coat in things like this, but also the treads on the feet, which you can see just down here. Once you're happy with the cables picked out in that off black, we can then move into adding the pitch black onto the miniature. And with this, we can do 2 things at the same time, because we can use the colour to shade that off black that we've just done, and also to base coat in the black armour panels. So what you need is a pitch black, and here I'm going to be using some Doom Death black. And for these 2 processes, I've got 2 brushes. I'm going to be starting out with my size 00 here, but I also have that medium base coat brush on hand. But we'll start out with size 00. With this, you just need to get your black thinned down so it's a little bit inky, down to about that sort of consistency there. And then it's just a matter of running this into the recesses on the ridges of these pipes. So for example, if we look at this one just here, what we're aiming for are those little recessed areas, and we're just going to paint a line into each one. Just there like that. You see, nice and easy, nice and quick to do. Now once you've done that, we can move on to the other brush. So here I'm using that medium base coat brush, and this is for the black armor panels, which in the case of this color scheme is going to be the inside of these shoulder plates and a few little details on the weaponry as well. Now that we've got all that black cleaned up, we can move on to highlighting it. And for this, we're going to go through 2 greys, starting out with a darker one. In this case, we're going to use Dungeon Stone Grey. And then to help the black really stand out, we'll go for a lighter grey finished off with a fine highlight, just like we did in that green. Here I'm going to be using Carcharodon Grey. We'll start out with Dungeon Stone Grey, and to apply this, go for your small brush again. So here I'm back to the size 00, and this is going to be just edge highlighting in exactly the same way that we did on the green and on the gold, where we're looking for those edges and corners and want to follow along each one. So remember, it's all about making sure the paint's thinned down correctly and that your brush isn't overloaded, and then we can start looking for those edges, such as the ones that we get on the shoulder pad just here. You can see we've got these vents, and so what we want to do is just make sure we're nice and comfortable and carefully go in and just use the side of the brush to skim away around the outside to get a nice highlight on those edges. Now when it comes to the cables, what you can do here is just make sure you don't have much paint on your brush. I tend to just wipe it off with my thumb there like that, because now you don't have much paint on your brush, you can just skim along those ridges and the paintbrush will only catch the raised areas, giving you highlights on them really quickly and really easily. And once that's done, if you then want to add a fine highlight, switch up to a light grey. Here I've got some Carcharodon grey, and with this we're looking to pick out just the sharpest corners and edges with a little flick of this colour, and also just do a little pinpoint on the rivets as well. And with that, the black is now completed, so it's time to move on to the next detail. Now, you might be wanting to add that flame pattern that appears on the box art onto the front of the shoulder plates, and we are going to do that later on, but if you don't want to do it, then the shoulders at this point are pretty much finished and ready for some transfers. But before we do any of the flames or anything like that, the next thing to do is to pick out the targeting lenses and also the eye lenses, which we can do at the same time. And to do this, you need to start out with a darker red. Now, here I'm going to use some Asmodeus red, and once that's on there, we should carefully apply a black wash over the top. So here I'm going to use Oblivion black wash. But we'll start out with Asmodeus red, and to apply it I'm going to go for the small brush again, so it's back to the size 00 because these details tend to be quite small and they are scattered all across the miniature, so definitely keep an eye out for them and just consult the box art to guide you through what sort of bits to pick out here. But basically it's any sort of lights that you can find on the miniature and of course the eyes. So to do this, make sure your paint's thinned down and just be careful to make sure there's not loads on the brush. And here we can begin with those eye lenses, which we just need to carefully move in from the side like this and just very gently let this colour just run into the recess of the lens. So just in there like that. Now meanwhile, for the targeting lenses, what we're looking at are smaller ones such as this one just in here, and all you need to do is just carefully pick them out. Once you've found them all, we're then ready to move on to applying a black wash. So here I've got Oblivion black wash. I'm still using the size 00 brush because as you can see, we don't need very much. We just need to make sure it's washed over the red. So into that eye lens recess just there, and the targeting lenses too. Once the wash is dry, we can then highlight these lenses and the eyes to give them that nice sort of glassy glowing effect. And to do this, we now need a bright red. So here I'm going to use some Demon Red. Then we can move on to an orange. For this, I'm using some Orange Flare. Next up, we'll need a bright yellow. So in this case, I'm going to use some Yellow Flame. And then finally, just to finish off the eye lenses, we just need to add in the appearance like a reflective shine. For this, I'm going to use some White Star. But first of all, we need some Demon Red. And to apply this one, go for your smallest brush. So here I'm using the size 00 again. And with this, we now want to introduce highlights into some quite specific areas on these details. So thin that paint down, make it a little bit translucent there on your palette, and then make sure you only have a small amount on there so you've got that fine point on your brush. And then we'll start out with these eye lenses where what we're aiming for is a small amount of this colour towards the front of each one. So on this one, for example, that means just applying the colour right there, going about 2/3 of the way back towards the darker side of it. Then for the little targeting lenses, we're looking to apply a circle in the middle of them, leaving a little bit of that dark red showing around the outside. Next up, we can move on to a bright orange. So here I've got some Orange Flare still being applied to the size 00 brush. And this time on the eye lenses, we're looking for a line around about 1/4 to half the distance back from the front. So we're looking at just focusing it towards that region just there. Then on the targeting lenses, it's another dot, but this time just a little bit smaller than the previous colour. Next up, it's time to add some yellow. So here I've got some Yellow Flame, and with this we're just looking for a small amount towards the front of each eye lens now, just a little dot right in that region just there, and then for the lenses, just a small dot in the centre of each one. And then finally, we just need a white. So here I'm using White Star, and this is for the eye lenses only. All we've got to do is put a tiny little dot at the back of each one to give the appearance of a specular highlight. And once you've finished applying those dots, you can see we now have that nice glassy effect there on the eye lenses. So it's time to move on to the next feature, which is going to be to concentrate on the heavy plasma bombard, because we now need to paint the plasma coils that appear on there. Now to do this, what you should do is start out with a deep turquoise. So I'm going to use some sentient turquoise for this, and to apply it, go for a medium-sized brush. So I'm using my size 1 for this one. Now what we want to do is just base coat these details in at this time, but if you want to, you can also add in the surrounding glow, and if you decide to do so, that effect does start now because we can use the same colour for it. So what you need to do is to prepare for it by making sure the paint is nice and thin, and then we can start applying it. And so what we're looking to do is to block in these sections just here. You can see these coils, and you just want to base coat these as neatly as possible. But if you decide that you want to add that surrounding glow, what you should do is just get a small amount of this on your brush, and as you get up to the black surrounding it, just bring the colour a little bit onto it. So a short distance there, around about a millimetre or so there, like that. And here we have those coils now base coated, and you can see I have gone around the edge to add in that glow, just going onto those black parts just there. And where these bars come over the coils, I've also just run some of that blue very thinly onto the inside of those as well, just for the light coming off the coils there. In addition, on the inside of the barrel, I've just run some down into that deep area right there too. So with that done, we can now move on to pushing the effect further by moving into some lighter turquoises. So going to move on to some Cursed Blue, followed by some Ray Gun Glow. But we need to start out with Cursed Blue to really get things moving. And so to apply this time, going for a slightly smaller brush, going for a size 0 here. And what we want to do is approach this as both a layer and a highlight based upon what sort of area that we're doing. So to begin with, we're going to go at it like a layer, and this is going to be on the coils where we're aiming towards the middle of these regions. So if we look at this one just here, for example, that means we're just looking to apply this colour so it runs into the recessed areas just in this area here. So quite a heavy layer, but as you get towards the outside, in this case, just make sure you don't have much paint on your brush and start to revert to using the side of the bristles so that as you get towards that corner, that deeper blue starts to appear in the recesses and also goes into that corner where the coils meet that edge of the black detail just there. Now once done that, we can then move on to adding a bit more to the glow that we've got on these surrounding areas, and in this case it's going to be an edge highlight. So you just want to apply this as finely as possible, following those sharp edges just in the direction that the light would catch as it comes around this part of the metal. So just around here, for example. Next up, we can move further into a brighter blue with some Ray Gun Glow, and this time we're looking to highlight on the coils, so you can see I'm approaching with the side of the brush without much paint on there, just to gently skim downwards like this to pick out that raised up part that we got towards the middle, so very gently there like that. And then we can also add this onto the outside if you're going for that glowing effect with a very fine edge highlight, very neatly applied all the way around. With this stage reached, you can see the effect is coming along nicely now. So what we can do is take it even further by starting to add some white into it. But what we want to do is make sure we mix it with the blue we've been using to really build up that sort of bluish effect. So what I'm going to be using now is some Ray Gun Glow and also some white star at the same time. Now to apply it this time, I'm going for a really fine brush. So I'm down to my size 00 for this one. And we need to start out by creating a mix. And you see I've got the two colours next to each other just here. What I'm going to do is start out by just getting some of the blue, grabbing a bit of the white, mixing those together to create a very pale version of this colour. So very, very light, kind of about that sort of point just there. Now in addition, we want to make sure we've got some of the white available to use, so I'm just going to thin some of this blue mix down to be ready, and then we'll also add a touch of water into the white as well to make sure that's thinned down and ready as well. So there we go. And then what we're going to do is start out with the mix. So you just need to load up some of this, and then on this plasma cannon, we're looking now to highlight towards the center of these coils. So remember, make sure you don't have much paint on your brush. You can always wipe off a bit of excess there on your thumb and use the side of the brush to very gently skim it down the middle of each section. So very gently there like that. Now once done that, we can then take it even further by just using the white. So I'm just going to grab some of the white, and I'm not even washing my brush for this, just to give a hint of that blue still in it. Again, same procedure, make sure you don't have much paint in your brush and just gently skim it even further towards the center of each section of these coils. And with that done, the plasma effect is now completed. So it's time to move on to the big one, because now what we're going to do is add that fire effect onto the front of the shoulder pads on the Dreadnought. Now this is entirely optional and you certainly don't have to do it. In fact, if you don't want to, you're now ready to move on to adding some transfers onto your miniature, and it's very nearly finished. But if you do want to do the fire, the plan is that we're going to start out by glazing on some red to build up the sort of core of the heat of the flames. So we'll do some glazing with that, and then once that's done, we'll paint the coals over the top. After that, we can move into some highlights to finish the effect off. So this all really revolves around doing that glazing first of all. The first stage is to do it with a dark red. So here I'm going to use some Dread Red, then we need to move on to a brighter, more sort of medium red. So here I'm going to use Sanguine Scarlet. But we'll start out with Dread Red, and to apply it, I'm going for my size 1 brush. And for glazing, what you need to do is really heavily thin the paint down with water first of all. Now having a wet palette really helps out with doing this, because it allows you to find that sweet spot and keep the paint there for longer. So I do recommend using one if you're doing this. But what you do is add lots of water into the paint, and you can see just how much I'm adding here to make it really runny, almost like making it look like a watercolor in fact. So you want to go right down to about this sort of consistency, then remove the paint off your brush, and then we can test it on the palette. So if you paint it thinly like that, you can see we get a very, very translucent version of the paint there. Now that's still a little bit too strong, so I'm just going to add a bit more water to it, and then again remove the excess, try again. That's a bit more what we're looking for. So we want to make sure we've got that very thin version there that we can just gradually build up through successive coats. So with that prepared, what you need to do each time is load up your brush, and get some tissue paper, remove the excess. And even though it looks like there's no paint left in the brush there's actually the correct amount for what you need. And what we need to do is start applying this thinly onto these shoulders, so this one for example, by starting where it's going to be the weakest and then drawing the paint down to where it's going to be the hottest. Now the reason is because very subtly, as you move that brush away, what happens is more of the paint collects in that region, so you get slightly stronger colour in that area. But you can see it's such a large area to cover that it doesn't really matter a great deal about being totally smooth about it. Instead, what you want to do is just get that thin colour just built up there like that, which after the first pass will look like nothing's happened. But that's exactly what should be the case, because as you start adding further coats, the colour is going to get stronger and stronger. So here we go with the second one. Again, just drawing it down towards the bottom there like that with these smooth motions. And as you keep on going, you'll find the red starts to get more and more intense. Now, obviously, you'll have to do this quite a bit, but just have some patience with it to gradually build it up, and you'll find you'll start to get that dread red becoming quite intense around about halfway down. You see, at this point, it's starting to appear there like that. And here we have the result of building up that dark red, and if you look closely you can see it's not actually perfect with the build-up of the colour in some areas. You can see a few brush marks such as around there, but that's okay because most of this is going to get covered with the coals later on, so it only needs to be something like that before you move on. But once you have built up to about that point, we can move on to a brighter red. So here I'm using Sanguine Scarlet applied to the size 1 brush. In the exact same way, we just want to glaze it thinly a little bit further down now, in this sort of region down here, up until we get a solid application of Sanguine Scarlet towards the bottom around there. And here we have the result of adding in that brighter red. And just like before, you can see the gradient isn't actually perfect, but it is good enough for what we're going to be doing here, because remember, we are going to be painting the coals over most of it. And speaking of the coals, that's what we're going to be doing now. For this, what you need is the same pitch black that you used on the armor earlier on. So for us, it's going to be some Doom Death black. And to apply it, I'm going for my size 0 brush, but you might want to go for a smaller one. The choice is yours. But with this, what we're now going to do is start freehanding the coals over the top of the red that we've just done. So essentially what we're going to be painting in is lots of sort of blob shapes with a few kind of irregular straight edges to them. So to do this, thin your paint down so it's a little bit inky on the palette, down to about that sort of consistency. Just make sure you don't have much paint on there so that you retain that fine point on the bristles. And then we can start painting these in. And to begin with at the bottom, which is where I recommend you start just down here, what you should do is start applying them in, leaving a little bit of that red visible in between the coal and the trim that we've got just down there. So you can see, just start painting it in a rough shape, not thinking too much about it, a little bit random there like that. And once you've got one, then give a little bit of a distance and then start doing another one, just painting in there like that, and then again leave a distance and paint another one, and basically just carry on doing this. Now you can see this does require a little bit of care, just taking your time and applying it, which means that first coat is going to be quite thin because of how much you thin down the paint. It means it's going to be a little bit translucent, so once it's dry, just do a second coat over the top just to establish that pitch black, so just there like that. Now I do recommend to make sure that you have an image of the heavy metal miniature just at hand whilst you're doing this, just for a bit of guidance. And you can see they do this kind of thing being quite small towards the bottom, but as they go further up, the coals start to get a little bit larger. So don't be afraid to do some bigger ones such as around here, but just take your time, always just making sure you leave some of that red showing in between each one. And here we have the result of painting those coals over the top of that blended red. You can see we've got a nice random pattern on either side, and once you get into the rhythm of it, doing this is actually pretty straightforward. So much easier to do it this way around than it would be trying to paint it all black than putting the red lines in amongst it. But with that done, we can, well, leave it there if you really want to, because it will look great in the tabletop like this. But if you really want to stand out, then what I recommend you do is add in some brighter colours to it. So that's what we're going to do now. What we need first is a bright red, so here I'm using Demon Red. Then we'll move on to an orange, and here I'm going to use some orange flare, and then we'll finish off with a nice bright yellow. So for this, I'm going to use some yellow flame. But we'll start out with Demon Red, and to apply it, I recommend you go for your smallest brush now. So I'm using my size 00, and what we need to do is introduce this colour into the lines in between the coals in the hottest part of the fire. So generally towards the bottom of it, going up to around about halfway, and just trying to keep it narrow as we go. So what you need to do is prepare the paint as if you're going to be edge highlighting, so thinning it down to about that sort of point just there. Make sure you don't have tons on your brush so you retain that fine point, and then we can start adding this in. If we go to this side first of all, what we're aiming for is to start painting it in between these coals as lines. So for example, just there, just going down there, then just connecting in just there, and then rotating around like this. You can see I'm always doing this almost downward motion. I'm just turning the model so I'm nice and comfortable, so it's a nice easy thing just to keep repeating all the way around. Now you really need to focus this down towards the bottom of the shoulder plates. So we're really going to be concentrating in this region down here. You want to bring it up to about this sort of point where you allow the lines just to peter out into points. So just going thinly up to there like that, and then thinly up there. And then beyond here, just look for some of the bigger intersections and just introduce a little bit of this red into those areas. So just small little touches like this. Next, it's time to add some orange. So here I'm moving on to some orange flare. And by and large, this is going to be the same sort of application, but with just some slightly finer lines this time, again, focusing towards the central part. Now, this time, we're generally looking at this sort of area right here. So only just touching onto the sides, with just a little bit of this colour down towards the bottom. But the main part of it is going to be building up in this region in the middle, just to really intensify the heat in this area. And then finally, it's time to move on to a bright yellow. So here I've got some yellow flame, and this is just going to be highlighted in the same sort of way, but really focusing towards the bottom of the fire now. And really it's going to be principally in this region just here. So kind of just above the corner of the opening that we've got on the armor here for the sensor. So I want a few lines just connecting around here. And then as you get a bit further up, again, just start doing those little dots on intersections between the other parts. So for example, little dots around areas like this. And with that done, that fire effect is complete. And as you've seen, doing this is actually very straightforward. It's just a matter of starting out by glazing in those reds and then painting the coals over the top. And once you've done that, it's very easy just to add the highlights to finish the effect off. Now with that done, we're at a stage where we can now glue on the weapon arms and then apply the transfers. So I'm going to do that. And when we come back, we'll start doing some weathering. And here we have the Saturnine Dreadnought with the transfers applied and the arms glued on. And at this stage, all it needs is to be based and then it's ready for the tabletop. But you might want to do some weathering on the miniature to give it a bit more narrative and give it some character as well. And if you want to do that, now is the time to do it. And when it comes to weathering the miniature, this very much is a personal taste kind of thing. You can do as much or as little as you like. Now for myself with the Salamanders, I find that I like to go quite light on the weathering with their vehicles because they really look after their equipment to a standard beyond the other Legions of Astartes. So I'm just going to do a few light things on here, but of course if you want to add more and really want to go to town with it, then please feel free to do so, and I recommend you check out some of our other videos painting some vehicles to get some examples of that. But for this miniature, what we're going to do is some chipping to give the appearance that it's been hit by some gunfire or some debris or something like that. And the first stage of this is to chip into the transfers to give the impression that it's paint scratching off. Now for this, what you should do is go back to the original green that you used for the armor, which in our case is going to be Vulkan green, and to apply it this time, what you should do is go for a fine brush. So here I'm using a size 00. All you need to do for this is to get some of this onto your palette, just there like that. Make sure you've got a good point on your brush once it's loaded up, and then we can just start etching into some of these transfers. Now you don't have to go to town with this really, you can just do little bits or you can do quite a lot, the choice is yours, but what you do is just start dotting into them a little bit, just to start cutting them ever so slightly like that to give the impression that the paint is just scratching away. So for example, you can see I'm just going to that side of the ring there on the Salamanders Legion symbol, and we do a few little scratches going down here as well with the tip of the brush, just some lines there like that. See, it's nice and easy, but it just gives that strange optical illusion that they're painted on rather than being transfers. So now it's just a matter of doing this until you're happy. And here we have the scratching now applied onto those transfers. So now what we can do is a bit more scratching on the green of the armor. Now I am deliberately going to be avoiding doing any scratching on the part where we did that fire effect on there, mostly because I don't want to sort of take away from the effect of it. But instead we're going to concentrate on the green, and here to get some nice contrast, a warm brown will do really well. So I'm going to be using cuirassed leather, and to apply it what you need is a fine brush, so I've got my size 00, but also a bit of sponge as well. Now when it comes to the sponge, what you should do is just get it balled up in your fingers. So you can see what I'm going to do is just place it together there like that, and then with this you just dip it into a small amount of the paint, and then on your dry palette just start dabbing it to really push it in there and remove the excess paint, and then just start working your way along like this. And the idea is to bring it down until you get about this sort of application appearing on your palette. And then what you do is just think about where you get chipping appearing on the armor, so edges and corners and things, such as on the front of the sarcophagus just here. And what you do is just start dotting it on like this, so you get a random speckling of that brown catching edges and corners to give you that appearance of paint chipping away there like that. Now every now and then as you're doing this, it's a good idea to switch over to that fine brush. So here I'm just grabbing the size 00, and with this what you can do is build out on some of these scratches in a more controlled fashion and connect some of them up, and also add some lines to things there like that to give the impression of deeper scratches in the armor. Once you're happy with that darker colour of the chipping, the next thing that we need to do is highlight it, and for this it's a matter of moving on to the colour that you used to highlight these areas of armour earlier on. So in the case of green, we'll be using some Gung-ho Green, so that's what I'm going to go for here, and to apply it this time you just want to go straight to your small brush, so right down to the size 00. And with this we need to start highlighting underneath the larger chips, and you don't have to do all of them, it's just the bigger ones, and what this does is creates the illusion that they're actually etched into the armour. So what you're going to do is get the paint thinned down under control on your brush with that fine point, and then we can start looking for these, such as these little chips we got on the front of the sarcophagus just here. And you see what I'm doing is just looking for the larger ones, and I'm just going to run a little bit of this colour directly underneath each one, just mirroring them all the way down. And with that, the chipping is now complete, and so the next effect that we're going to add is going to be a heat distortion just on the end of the disintegrator barrels just there. And so to do this, we're just going to be using some washers and applying them on in kind of rings and blend them into each other. Need to start out with a blue wash, so here I'm going to use some Tempest Blue wash. Then we'll need a purple, so I'm going to use Magi Purple wash. Then finally we need a sort of sepia yellow kind of colour, so I'm going to use Archaic Sepia wash for this one. We'll start out with the blue, so I'm using Tempest Blue wash, and to apply it I'm going for my size 1 brush. And what we need to do is get some of this wash thinned down with a bit of water, and water will be absolutely fine in the case of this. What you want to do is get it thinned down to about that sort of strength, then just load up a small amount on your brush, and on the end of the guns what we need to do is just apply it around the ends. Now sometimes it means holding it in quite a weird way to be comfortable, such as upside down like this, but all you do is apply it around the end of the barrel there like that, and then whilst the paint is still wet, quickly wash your brush, make sure it's damp with just a little bit of water, and then just use it just to smudge it at the end there to draw it out onto that silver. Once that's dry, we can then move on to the purple. So here I've got some Magi Purple wash, which I've set up in the exact same way. And what we want to do is introduce this just behind the blue, making sure to overlap a little bit onto the blue. And just like we did with that previous step, draw it a small distance back to about there, then wash your brush, make sure it's damp, and use it just to draw that colour out so it fades into the silver beyond it. And then finally we can move on to a sepia. So here I've got some Archaic Sepia, which once again I've set up by just thinning it with a little bit of water, and here we're doing the exact same thing, just moving a little bit further back from the purple. So just overlapping slightly onto it, going a short distance back, then wash your brush, make sure it's damp, and use it just to draw it out into the silver beyond it. Now with this done, the miniature is ready to be based, and as ever it's your choice entirely what scheme you go for, but for this example I'm going to be going for an urban rug base. With the base now fully painted, this Salanders Saturnine Dreadnought is complete and ready to be betrayed in the drop site massacre. So when it comes to painting the Saturnine Dreadnought, it's a good idea to look for some sub-assemblies, in particular those ones with the shoulder plates, because if you keep those separate, you'll find that painting all the intricate silver mechanical detail and all the other metallics around there is really straightforward. Then partway through painting the miniature, you just glue them on, and painting the rest of it is a breeze. Now if you're painting yours in the colours of the Salamanders, of course a key part on this scheme is that flame pattern that appears on the shoulders. This is entirely optional, but if you want to push yourself and have a go, just be aware it's not at all as difficult as it might first appear. It just revolves around doing that glazing of the reds first of all, and it doesn't have to be perfect glazing either because you cover up so much of it with the black coals. The trickiest part is painting those coals, and it's really not all that difficult. It's just a matter of working your way through it and just not thinking too much about the pattern to keep it nice and random. But once that's done, all you got to do is highlight in between them, and then the miniature is going to look great. So have fun painting your Dreadnought, and we'll see you again very soon.